we have spent some time thinking about practical theology, but I also think there's another way that we can advocate for young people, and that is through learner-centered pedagogy. And I just want to give you some thoughts on what I mean by that and why I think it's so crucial in the ways that we think about youth ministry and discipleship and formation and all that comes with that. Now, in some of the readings that we're doing, you're gonna read Argyris, and he says this. He says, success in the marketplace increasingly depends on learning, yet most people don't know how to learn. Okay. Interesting comment. I think in some ways that's really, really true. Let me just give you a case in point. How many people do you know when they say, you know what, I read this article on XYZ, and then when you push them further, you realize that they basically just saw like a feed from, from Threads or from X, and like they didn't really read the article. They like read the headline, right? Like I think it's really hard for people to actually learn, and there's a lot of reasons for that, which we can get into in just a second. But I think we just have to keep that in mind, that learning is actually really, really hard, and when we don't recognize that, I think it can be really, really difficult when we think about the ways that we teach and the way, especially that we teach young people. Byron Tagg, another article that you're going to read, says this, that the learning paradigm ends the lecturer's privileged position, honoring in its place whatever approaches serve best to prompt learning of particular knowledge by particular students. So what Byron Tagg is getting at is that the shift from sort of a teacher perspective to a learner perspective places the learner in the center of the room. The teacher becomes aware and sensitive to the situation, the history, the story, the experiences of learners and what they're going through, and begins to think about how they teach and learn in such a way where the starting point is not me, the teacher, disseminating information on the learners, but the learners as the starting point, and the teacher trying to draw out the concepts and ideas and learnings of the learner. Okay, so that, I think that's really, really important. And there's a lot of different names for this. There's learner-centered pedagogy. And a lot of times in course room design, we talk about the flipped classroom or backward design. There's lots of ways to think about that. Now, theoretically, one of the ways we could think about this, and Argyris talks about this, is this idea of single and double loop learning. Now, single loop learning really kind of has this idea that it basically is in single loop learning, all you're trying to do is you're trying to sort of adjust and make tweaks to a system that you already think is pretty relevant. Think of this like a thermostat, okay? So if you want it at a particular temperature, when the temperature goes below a particular amount, the heat kicks in and it moves back up to the temperature. Or if it gets too hot, the air conditioning kicks in and it brings it back down. The system is pretty set, and all that you're doing is you're making slight adjustments in order to maintain a particular expectation that you have. So the norms themselves remain unchanged. Instead, what happens is you're just trying to somehow maintain the status quo and trying to make sure that you don't move away from any sort of divergence, okay? Now, single loop learning is fine. I mean, this is a way that we sort of think about life in general, especially in ministry. This is where we keep the programs running. This is where we keep doing what we're doing, but maybe we improve on the Sunday morning service, or we try to find new ways to recruit people, or we think about how to make sure that young people show up in small group, or parents come to the parents' meetings, right? We're finding different ways to accomplish an assumption that we have about the way the world ought to work, or how our ministry ought to work. And single loop learning seeks to somehow make those adjustments to make that work. Now, double loop learning is a little bit different. Double loop learning comes along when we begin to actually question the assumptions of the way something is working. So sometimes what will happen is when single loop learning doesn't work anymore, or you're not getting the results that you have, you begin to ask deeper questions of the assumptions you have about the way you want something to work. And that moves you, instead of going in a circle over and over again in the single loop, you'll see what happens is, if you follow like the white to the green, we go to the double loop where we move outside the system and ask different questions. We begin to question our assumptions. We begin to question perhaps the ways that we think about what we're doing, or our theology, or our assumption about our communities, or the competencies of those that are leading, or whatever it might be. Double loop learning moves us to ask deeper questions that move us outside the system for a second, rather than just trying to make tweaks within the system to actually move in a new direction. And I'll give you some examples of that in a second, but that's what double loop learning is all about. Now, you're going to learn about this a little bit later when you read Sticky Faith Innovation. We talk about this idea of best practices and first practices. Best practices are when you are constantly just trying to improve on something that you're already doing, right? So let's say you have youth group and you have a Wednesday night service and you think it goes pretty well, but you want to reach out and get training to make Wednesday night services, youth service, better, right? Or you need a better curriculum, or you want to work on making better or different songs, or whatever it might be, right? The structure of Wednesday night hasn't changed. You're just trying to improve upon it. So that's sort of our commitment to best practices. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like, in some ways, we want to get better at what we're doing. But there are times when something isn't working anymore, when the ways that we've tried something don't seem to have the same sort of effect. And so what we have to do is we have to move to what we call first practices. And that is actually setting off and stepping away from the best practices and try something new for the first time. And this is where we oftentimes evoke a new imagination, because what we do is we let go of the assumptions and we begin to question them in order to have a picture of a new reality. Now, I don't want to just say, because we wrote on this, that it's completely right, nor do I want to say that Jesus exactly did this, but it is really interesting that Jesus constantly says through the scriptures, in the Gospels, you've heard it said this, but I say this, right? Do you see what he's doing? He's kind of saying, here you are doing best practices over here, but we're going to double it, loop it here, and we're going to do something completely different, because this is what I say, and this is what I think you're really getting at, right? So Jesus is always sort of undercutting the assumptions and getting to the heart of the issue. I think this is why when you look at the scriptures, sometimes Jesus will say something, and then like the narrative in the Gospels will be like, and then they try to kill him. Like, and I mean, if you really think about it, it's like, wow, that's really dramatic. Like, a bunch of hotheads. Like, can't we just have a conversation? It seems pretty dramatic because you want to kill them, right? But I think this is what happens. I think that when we move from best practices to first practices, when we begin to question our assumptions, we begin to question things that for many people are non-negotiable. We're pushing them to think about things that they thought were set in stone, and to disrupt beliefs that are oftentimes assumed to be givens and not up for debate. It evokes emotions that are often quite dramatic and quite strong, and even we see in the scriptures, like to the point of being murderous, right? So in Jesus' case, you have this example where, you have the Pharisees get to the point where, like, we don't like that you are challenging our assumptions. So instead of reflecting on our assumptions, we're going to kill you so that we don't have to do that. Okay, that's kind of what's going on there. It's kind of crazy, right? But we do it all the time. And so I think sometimes this is where we get to when we think about single and double loop learning. It's another way to think about it is like single loop learning is more like the how. Like, how do we do something? How do we do it better? How can we improve on something? How can we become more efficient, more godly, more professional, more efficient, whatever it might be, we can do that. The why asks a different question in double loop learning. Well, why do we do it that way? Why do we assume that's the right way? Why, out of all the ways to think about it, have we landed on this starting point rather than this starting point? You see what I mean? So the why asks these deeper, more profound questions, and this is what happens in double loop learning, or what we would call first practices. It's interesting. Jack Mezirow is sort of the thinker behind transformative learning theory. And he talks about this idea that transformative learning theory gets to this point of not only critically reflecting on assumptions, right? But critically reflecting, self-reflecting on our assumptions. So we're not just reflecting on the assumptions, we're reflecting on why I'm assuming that those assumptions are actually the assumptions. You see what's going on there? It's a deeper reflection to actually question oneself and to begin to understand the why behind the what and everything that we do. So again, if we think about that, we've got the critical reflection on assumptions is oftentimes a single loop learning, and then the critical self-reflection on assumptions is really asking the why questions about, well, why do I do things that way? Why is that important to me? How did I arrive at this way of looking at the world? I know I'm using this model to judge it, but how did I get to this? And this is what I think can become really helpful, because I think this is where we become much more self-aware, right? Like I think when I think about my critical self reflection of assumptions, I began to ask questions of like, well, why do I act the way that I act? Why do I teach how I teach? How do people experience me when I show up in a room as a white male, as an authority figure? What parts of my life do I gravitate toward and shy away from because of my family history, or of my background, or my religious tradition, or my gender, or whatever it might be, right? These type of questions evoke a deeper understanding of who we are, and it helps us to understand oftentimes the way that we look at the world and the way that we interact with the world as well. And so this is hard work. I mean, this is where the learning really happens, and it can be really challenging. Now, when it comes to ministry, I think one of the ways to think about it is this, is that when we just reflect on our assumptions, we can sometimes leave to this point of doing these sort of ministry things in youth ministry, right? How do I improve youth group, or grow our church, or help people grow up, or keep young people from leaving the church? Or how do we welcome LGBTQIA teenagers, right? Those are all good things, and those are great questions. But maybe the deeper questions are these: what are our perceptions of teenagers? Maybe that affects how we actually improve youth group. What's the role of our church in our community, right? I mean, is it really just about getting bigger, or what are we actually like? What are we actually all about, right? We want to help young people grow up, but when does adulthood really begin? What assumptions am I bringing to the table about what it means to be a young adult? You see where that goes? Instead of keeping people in church, like, where are young people going, and why? Why are we so worried about where they're not, but where are they, right? I mean, maybe those are the questions we have to ask. Or, when we think about like being welcoming to LGBTQIA young people, I mean, maybe we have to ask the question: are LGBTQIA teenagers gifts to our community, or problems? How are we thinking about them? Right? Yeah, I know you want to welcome them, but how do you see them? Right? And so these get to some really, really important and profound questions that I think challenge the ways that we think and look at the world. And this is why, going back to the beginning, why learning is hard. Because we are designed as human beings to be efficient with our learning. And what we like more than anything else is to be right, and to not have to work too hard with changing our minds. But a true sense of changing our minds requires a dramatic shift in our thinking. Mezirow talks about this. He actually gives a whole list of things. He says what happens at first when we think about having to move to changing our minds, we have a disorienting dilemma. Something doesn't work anymore. So then we have to examine it, and there's usually guilt and shame associated with that. And then so we assess our assumptions. Maybe like the way that we got here was wrong or different, that we have to think about. And so then we recognize the fact that there's discontent, and we're in this mode of transformation, and we realize that as we're going through this, that we're not the only ones, that others have felt that as well. So that gives us a bit of encouragement. And so then we begin to explore new options, roles, relationships, or actions to kind of work through whatever that might be. And then we plan a new course of action, which requires the acquisition of perhaps new knowledge or skills or implementation of one's plans. And then we actually try out those new roles. And then we build competence and self-confidence in that, which really brings a sort of reintegration into one's life. And there's congruency again for us to see the world in a different way and to live consistently with the challenge that we had before that we live now. Now that's a lot of work, right? Like, I think sometimes in Christian circles, when we think about this, we lose sight of the fact that what this ultimately is conversion, right? And a lot of times we think of conversion as like, well, just pray the prayer, right? Like, just come to Jesus, it'll all work out, right? Rather than recognizing the fact that conversion is this major shift of seeing the world and following the best that we can, the norms and the expectations of the way we think the world works, and turning a completely different direction, and then trying to operate with a completely different set of rules and parameters and aspirations along the way. It's dramatic, it's overwhelming, it's exhausting, and it's hopeful. And I think when we keep this in mind, we recognize the fact that as we think about discipleship with young people, as we think about what it means to advocate for them, that there is a deep and profound process that we are inviting them into, and they need our accompaniment along the way. Now, another way I think about learner-centered and teacher-centered teaching and learning is maybe by this list. It's a big list, but you can look at it on your own a little bit later. When I think about learner-centered, sometimes I think these are the questions and assumptions that we have in youth ministry. Like, are they saved? Are they attending church? Do they know the answer to what I've taught them? Can they give their testimony? Is their faith exclusive and unwavering? You can read some of the other ones here. A lot of times, teacher-centered approach can encourage a passive way of living out their faith. It can become competitive. It can be individualistic. It can be controlling. It assumes that the life of faith is neat. And a lot of times we're always trying to use extrinsic motivation to keep them fired up, right? This is sort of the idea that comes with a teacher-centered approach. But when we think about learner-centered, we ask different questions of young people. What of their faith journey can they articulate now, and what is still in process? Are they participating not just in church, but outside of church in ways that they're living their lives? They may have some answers, but what questions are emerging for them? Are they able to use and think about grassroots ideas that they want to try rather than just doing what they're told? Are they active learners? Are they collaborative, communal? Do they feel this sense of liberation? Are they living a messy life because they're trying to make it all work? Are they finding, instead of living out of fear, out of joy, right? The ways that we communicate and invite people in to the good news of Jesus oftentimes is rooted in our perspective of how we teach and learn. And if we can have a learner-centered approach that is open to the possibility that one can change their mind and we can ask different questions about what it means to follow Jesus, it allows, I think, freedom for young people to find their way, because we are attending to where they are at rather than simply downloading the information that we think that they need to have. Okay? There's more to say about this, but I hope that this gives you some insights in that, which leads us some self-questions. Think about one of your best learning experiences. It could be in school or church or company, whatever it is. What did your teacher, mentor, pastor do to make it so good? Do you remember? What did you do? I mean, just think about those things for a second. And then reflect on one of your worst learning experience. How has that impacted your learning or even your teaching, right? What are some things you just stay away from because you had a bad experience? Or here's another question. How might our teaching change if we assumed that young people truly want to learn? It's hard, but perhaps that's part of them accomplishing the dreams that they want to have, is to actually find ways to make sense of the world. And are we accompanying them in such a ways that allows that to happen? Or are we squelching that because we have an agenda that we feel like they need to have? These are the challenges that come with discipleship, and I hope this can be helpful to you. So with that in mind, Let me leave you with this, my friends. May you know that there is a God um, that is inviting us into a better story, that we have the privilege to not only be captivated by, but to inspire young people to be invited and captivated by it too. May you never tire of paying attention to where young people are coming from. May you assume the best in their quest to learn and make sense of the world. And may you be a faithful journeyer with them along the way. And may you know God's grace and peace.